The call came in just after sunrise on a foggy October morning in Harlan County, Kentucky. The dispatcher almost missed it because the line crackled so badly it sounded like someone breathing into the receiver instead of speaking. When the boys finally formed words, it was quiet and strained, like someone who hadn't slept in days. The man said he lived along an old stretch of road outside the town limits, near a farmhouse that had been empty for years. He said the ground behind the house had collapsed overnight. At first he thought it was just a sinkhole, something that happens often enough in the Appalachian hills. But when he walked closer, he saw wooden boards sticking out of the dirt like broken ribs. And under them, he said, there were stairs. The dispatcher asked him to repeat that. Stairs, the man whispered again. Going down. By mid-morning, 2 Harlan County sheriff's deputies were driving along a narrow gravel road that twisted through forests so dense the sun barely touched the ground. The fog still clung to the hills, drifting through the trees like pale smoke. They had been to that road before. Everyone in the county knew the farmhouse. It had belonged to the Whitaker family decades earlier, a quiet group who kept to themselves and sold the land sometime in the late 1970s, before disappearing from the area entirely. After that, the property changed owners several times, but no one ever stayed long. Some said the water in the well tasted like metal. Others said the land itself felt wrong, like the ground hummed faintly at night. Most locals simply avoided it. When the deputies arrived, they found the caller waiting near a rusted wire fence. His truck was parked crookedly along the road, engine still running. He looked pale, and his eyes kept drifting toward the tree line behind the farmhouse. The house itself leaned slightly to one side, its gray boards warped by decades of rain and rot. Windows were broken, the porch sagged, and vines crawled up the walls like veins. You the one who called? One deputy asked. The man nodded but didn't speak. He simply pointed behind the house. The deputies walked around the structure, boots crunching through fallen leaves. About 20 yards behind the building, the earth had indeed collapsed inward, forming a wide hole nearly 10 feet across. The soil around it looked freshly disturbed, like something beneath the surface had finally given way after years of pressure. At the bottom of the pit were wooden boards, shattered and splintered. Beneath them, partially buried in dirt, was a staircase made of old stone blocks descending into darkness. The deputies stared at it for several seconds without saying anything. Neither of them remembered seeing any record of a basement or storm shelter attached to that farmhouse. The structure was far older than most houses in the county, built sometime in the early 1900s, but still, someone would have mentioned something like this. One deputy knelt near the edge and brushed dirt away from the top step. The stone felt smooth and cold beneath his glove, worn down as if countless feet had passed over it long ago. Looks old, he muttered. His partner leaned closer and shined a flashlight down the opening. The beam stretched into the darkness, revealing steps that disappeared about 15 feet below ground before turning sharply out of sight. The air drifting up from below smelled damp and strangely stale, like a room sealed for decades. They exchanged a glance. Technically, exploring it wasn't their job. If there was a collapsed structure or a potential hazard, they were supposed to call county inspectors. But something about the stairs bothered them. They were too carefully built for a simple cellar. And why had they been hidden beneath boards and soil in the first place? The deputy with the flashlight stepped carefully onto the first stone step. It held his weight easily. Just a quick look, he said. The other deputy followed. As they descended, the light from above faded quickly. Within seconds, the foggy daylight had shrunk to a pale square far overhead. The walls around the staircase were made of stacked limestone blocks, mortared together with an old technique rarely used anymore. Moisture clung to the stone surfaces, forming thin trails of water that trickled down toward the unseen bottom. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. At the 15th step, the staircase turned sharply to the right, just as the flashlight beam had revealed. When the deputy swung the light around the corner, the beam landed on a thick wooden door set directly into the stone wall. It looked massive, reinforced with iron bands that had rusted nearly black. The hinges were equally large, the kind used on old barn doors or heavy gates. But the detail that caught their attention was the lock. A thick iron chain had been wrapped around the door handle several times and secured with a padlock the size of a fist. The metal was heavily corroded, suggesting it had been there a very long time. The deputy tugged the chain experimentally. It didn't budge. "Why would someone chain a door underground?" the second deputy asked quietly. The first deputy didn't answer. He simply knelt and examined the area around the doorframe. The stone floor nearby was scratched and uneven, as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. "Maybe it was storage," he said after a moment. "Old mine supplies or something." But even as he said it, he didn't sound convinced. Harlan County had a long history of coal mining, and underground storage rooms weren't unusual in older properties. Still, this place felt different. The construction was too deliberate, too fortified, and the chain had clearly been placed from the outside. Someone had locked whatever was behind that door in or out. The deputy stood there silently for a moment, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly as it illuminated the rusted lock. Finally, one of them said, "We should call this in." The other nodded, but before they turned to leave, something else caught their attention. A faint sound drifted through the stone corridor. At first it was so quiet they thought it might just be water dripping somewhere in the darkness. But then it happened again. A dull, hollow thump. Both men froze. The sound had come from the other side of the door. They waited. The silence stretched for several seconds, thick and oppressive in the narrow passageway. Then it came again. Thump. Not loud, not violent. Just a slow, deliberate knock, like something tapping gently against the wood from the inside. The deputy holding the flashlight felt his stomach tighten. "Did you hear that?" His partner nodded slowly. They both stared at the chained door, their breaths echoing softly off the stone walls. Another thump sounded, slightly louder this time. The flashlight beam drifted down toward the base of the door. There was a narrow gap between the wood and the floor, barely an inch tall. Dust had collected along the edges over the years, forming a thin gray line. As the deputies watched, that line of dust shifted slightly. Something on the other side had just moved close to the door. Neither man spoke. The thumping stopped, and for a long moment the only sound in the underground corridor was the slow drip of water somewhere deeper in the darkness. Finally, the deputy stepped backward. "We're not opening that." His partner didn't argue. They climbed the staircase quickly, the cold air clinging to them as they returned to the daylight above. By the time they reached the surface, the fog had begun to thin, revealing the distant outlines of forested hills stretching across the county. The caller was still standing near the fence, watching them anxiously. "Well?" he asked. One deputy wiped dirt from his gloves and looked back toward the collapsed hole behind the farmhouse. "There's something down there," he said carefully. Within hours, the property was sealed off with yellow tape. Additional deputies arrived, followed by county officials and eventually a team from the Kentucky State Police. By late afternoon, several unmarked vehicles had joined them, including one belonging to a federal agency no one in town expected to see in a place like Harlan County. Word spread quickly through the nearby communities. People gathered along the road, whispering and pointing toward the farmhouse, but no one was allowed near the hole. And by sunset, a large white tent had been erected over the collapse site, completely blocking the view of whatever lay beneath the ground. What happened under that tent over the next 3 days was never officially explained, but the few officers who were present would later say the same thing when asked about it years later. They said the staircase was only the beginning, because behind that chain door, the underground structure didn't end. It went much deeper, and what the investigators eventually found beneath the Whitaker farmhouse was something no one in Harlan County had ever imagined could exist beneath their feet. By the second night, the road leading to the Whitaker farmhouse was completely sealed. State police cruisers blocked both directions, their blue lights flickering silently against the trees like distant lightning. Locals gathered as close as the barricades allowed, whispering to each other in low voices. In Harlan County, news traveled fast, but answers rarely came with it. Everyone knew something unusual was happening behind that farmhouse, yet no one seemed willing to say what it was. The white tent covering the collapsed hole glowed under powerful floodlights, From a distance, it looked like some strange medical facility that had been dropped into the forest overnight. Trucks came and went constantly, their tires crunching over gravel, while uniformed men carried equipment inside. Some wore sheriff's patches. Others wore plain dark jackets with no markings at all. Inside the tent, the staircase had been reinforced with metal braces and temporary supports. Investigators had widened the collapse site enough to safely move equipment below ground. Portable lights now illuminated the stone stairwell, casting harsh shadows along the damp walls. The chain door was no longer sealed. Earlier that afternoon, a cutting torch had been used to slice through the corroded padlock. When the chain fell away, it landed on the stone floor with a heavy metallic clatter that echoed down the narrow passage. For several seconds, no one moved. The door itself refused to open at first. It had been shut so long that the wood had swollen inside the stone frame. Two men had to push their shoulders against it, while another pried at the edge with a crowbar. Finally, the old hinges gave a groan that sounded almost human. The door creaked open only a few inches. A gust of air spilled out from the darkness beyond. Every person standing there noticed it immediately. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't just damp or stale like a typical cellar. There was a deeper odor beneath it, something metallic mixed with the faint rot of organic decay. The kind of smell that made the back of the throat tighten. One of the investigators stepped forward with a flashlight and slowly pushed the door wider. The beam cut into the darkness beyond, revealing a long stone corridor stretching farther than expected. The walls were built from the same stacked limestone as the staircase, but the passage was wider and more carefully constructed. Iron brackets along the walls held the remains of old lantern mounts, their glass long shattered. The floor was covered in a thin layer of gray dust, except for a trail running down the center. Someone had walked through here recently. The footprints were faint but unmistakable. A sheriff's deputy crouched to study them. "They're fresh," he said quietly. A murmur spread through the group. That made no sense. The staircase had been buried under soil and boards for years, possibly decades. No one should have been able to enter or leave this place. And yet the tracks clearly led deeper into the underground passage. The investigators followed them. The corridor extended for nearly 30 yards before opening into a large chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the hill. The ceiling was supported by thick wooden beams blackened with age. In the center of the room stood several long tables constructed from rough timber. The flashlight beams swept across the chamber slowly. At first it looked like some forgotten storage area. Then someone noticed the walls. Symbols had been carved into the stone, hundreds of them. Some were simple shapes, circles, triangles, jagged lines intersecting in strange patterns. Others resembled crude human figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The carvings overlapped each other, as though they had been etched over many years, and beneath them were words, names, dozens of names scratched into the limestone. Some were so faded they were barely legible. Others looked much newer, the grooves still sharp and pale compared to the darker stone around them. The state investigator ran his fingers along one of the carvings. Somebody spent a lot of time down here. Another officer turned his flashlight toward the far wall. That's when they saw the cages. 3 iron cages stood against the stone, each one about the size of a large dog kennel. Rust covered the bars, but the locks were intact. Inside the cages were piles of brittle fabric and old bones. Animal bones. At least that's what everyone assumed at first. Then a forensic technician knelt beside one of the cages and lifted a small skull from the debris. The room went silent. The skull was human. It belonged to a child. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. Someone quietly radioed for the forensic team above to come down immediately. While they waited, another officer began searching the rest of the chamber. Against one wall, he found a row of wooden crates stacked nearly to the ceiling. Most had rotted apart over time, their contents spilling across the floor. Inside were jars, hundreds of them, glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. Some contained small bones. Others held objects no one could immediately identify. One jar contained what looked disturbingly like a human finger. Another held several teeth floating at the bottom like pale pebbles. The deeper investigators searched the chamber, the stranger the discoveries became. In one corner stood a crude wooden chair bolted to the floor with heavy iron brackets. Leather restraints hung from the armrests, stiff and cracked with age. Above the chair, the stone ceiling was blackened as if fires had been lit directly overhead. It looked less like storage and more like a place where something had been done repeatedly. Something deliberate. A forensic specialist finally spoke up from the cage area. "There's more than one skeleton here." His voice echoed slightly in the chamber. "Some of these remains are very old, but some aren't." The words hung in the air like smoke. Above ground, more vehicles had arrived during the afternoon. Among them was a dark government SUV that drew curious glances from the local deputies. Two men stepped out wearing plain suits and quietly presented identification to the state police commander. Within minutes, they were escorted beneath the tent and down the stone staircase. When they reached the chamber below, both men stood silently for several seconds, taking in the carvings, the cages, the jars. One of them turned slowly to the investigators. "How many people know about this so far?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "Maybe 30, he said. Mostly officers and technicians." The suited man nodded once. "That number shouldn't get any higher." By the third day, the operation had changed completely. The tent above the collapse site had been expanded into a much larger structure surrounded by temporary fencing. Armed guards stood at the entrance checkpoints. No reporters were allowed anywhere near the road anymore. Inside the underground chamber, the investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. Behind the main room, another passage had been discovered, concealed by a wooden panel built into the wall. When the panel was removed, it revealed a narrow tunnel descending deeper into the earth. Unlike the upper structure, this section looked far older. The stonework was rougher, the ceiling lower, and the air was colder. The tunnel eventually opened into another chamber much larger than the first. This one had no wooden beams or tables, only a vast circular space carved directly into the rock. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols seen above, but here they were larger and more complex, spiraling outward from the center of the room. In the middle of the chamber stood a pit. It was perfectly round, about 8 feet across, and it went straight down into darkness. Investigators lowered a powerful light into the opening using a cable. The beam descended nearly 40 feet before reaching the bottom. What the light revealed made several officers step back immediately. The pit was filled with bones, hundreds of them, maybe more. Human bones layered on top of each other in a tangled mass that filled the entire shaft. Some looked ancient, bleached almost white. Others still had fragments of decayed clothing clinging to them. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then the suited man who had arrived earlier gave a quiet order: "Document everything." As the forensic team began photographing the pit, another investigator noticed something strange along the stone floor nearby. Fresh footprints, just like the ones in the upper corridor. They circled the edge of the pit before leading toward a narrow passage carved into the far wall. The footprints were small, too small for an adult. They looked like the tracks of a child. The tunnel they led into was barely tall enough for a grown person to crawl through. Investigators followed it carefully, their lights illuminating rough stone only inches from their faces. After about 20 feet, the passage opened into a small hidden room. Inside the room were blankets, food wrappers, and an old battery lantern still faintly warm. Someone had been living down here. Very recently. One of the investigators slowly turned his flashlight toward the corner of the chamber. That's when the beam caught movement. A small figure sat curled against the wall. At first, no one realized what they were looking at. The figure was thin, almost skeletal, with pale skin that reflected the harsh light. Long, dark hair hung over its face like a curtain. The investigators froze. For several seconds, the figure didn't move. Then, its head lifted slowly. The eyes staring back at them were wide and unblinking, reflecting the flashlight beams like those of an animal caught in the dark. The child didn't speak. It only watched them. Later, official reports would say the figure discovered beneath the Whitaker farmhouse was a boy approximately 10 years old. He was severely malnourished and could barely stand when they finally brought him to the surface. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't his physical condition. It was the things he said, because when doctors began asking how long he had been down there, the boy looked at them with confusion and quietly answered, "Always." Within hours, the child was transported away in a black medical transport vehicle accompanied by federal agents. The farmhouse property was cleared completely by the following morning. By the end of the week, the collapsed hole had been filled with concrete and heavy machinery had flattened the remaining structures on the land. Official statements described the operation as a routine environmental hazard cleanup related to an abandoned mine shaft. No mention was ever made of the chambers, the cages, or the pit filled with bones. The people of Harlan County eventually stopped asking questions. But a few deputies who were present during those 3 days still remember one final detail that never appeared in any report. When investigators returned to the underground chambers one last time before sealing the site permanently, the footprints circling the bone pit were gone, replaced by a new set of tracks, larger ones, leading deeper into the tunnel system beyond the chambers, toward passages no one had explored yet. And according to the officers who saw them, those tracks were heading up,